The Monday morning that changed everything began long before anyone understood what it meant. At the headquarters of Ashford Industries on Commonwealth Avenue in Boston, the grand lobby had been transformed overnight into something between a corporate reception and a private memorial. White lilies lined the marble columns. A portrait of Robert Ashford, silver-haired, steady-eyed, stood at the center of the atrium, flanked by candles and black ribbon. It was the first anniversary of his passing, and the day his daughter would face the entire executive council as its sole leader for the very first time. Everyone who walked through those doors that morning wore black tailored jackets, polished shoes. Voices kept low and careful. Even grief in the world of Ashford Industries followed a dress code. Marcus Webb did not fit that world. He was 39 years old, broad-shouldered with a kind of face that had once been sharp and was now worn honest by years of manual labor and single fatherhood. His maintenance uniform, deep navy blue, faded at the wrists, told the story of a man who had stopped measuring himself by what he wore. He moved through the lobby quietly, pushing his supply cart along the outer edge of the marble floor, mopping up footprints left by the morning's visitors. He worked fast but unhurried, the way a person does when they have spent years learning not to take up too much space in other people's mornings. He had a daughter waiting for him at the end of every shift. Lily Webb was 8 years old with chronic asthma that required 2 prescriptions and a standing appointment with a pediatric specialist across the city. Marcus worked the morning shift at Ashford and a second cleaning contract at an office tower 3 miles east, finishing some nights past 10. He slept in broken hours. In the inner pocket of his uniform jacket, he kept a photograph of Lily grinning with a gap where her front tooth had been. On the hardest mornings, he looked at it before stepping out of the car. He greeted the building's security guards by name. When a young intern spilled coffee near the east elevator and began apologizing, Marcus helped her without making her feel small. A senior manager passed by and looked at him the way people sometimes look at furniture, without curiosity, without acknowledgement, and Marcus kept working. He had stopped expecting to be seen. He had not stopped behaving as though it mattered. The clock above the reception desk read 5:47 when Marcus noticed the floral arrangement near the base of the grand staircase had been positioned directly in front of the emergency exit. He paused, glanced around the lobby, and moved the heavy stand 3 feet to the left. No one noticed. He returned to his cart, exchanged the mop for a soft cloth, and began wiping down the brass handrails. Tom Garrison, head of building security for the past 12 years, walked over with 2 cups of coffee from the break room. He handed one to Marcus without asking. "You see everything, Marcus? Should have been management." Marcus accepted the cup, took a sip. The coffee was terrible, as always. "I like what I do. Honest work." Tom nodded, unconvinced but respectful. "You coming to the memorial?" Marcus shook his head. "Not my place." Tom studied him for a moment, then walked back toward the security desk. Marcus returned to the handrails. He had learned a long time ago which battles deserved his voice. This was not one of them. By 8:50, the lobby had filled with executives and board members, all dressed in variations of the same expensive grief. Conversations hummed low, careful not to rise above the decorum the occasion demanded. Marcus worked along the outer edges, invisible by design. He had mopped the eastern corridor and was returning to his cart when Victoria Ashford appeared at the top of the main staircase. She was 34, composed in the way that had made rooms adjust to her since she was young. Her black suit was perfectly fitted, her dark hair pulled back with precision. Since her father's death, grief had calcified into something useful, an absolute intolerance for error. People did not merely respect Victoria, they were careful around her, which was something different. Marcus bent low at the base of the stairs, dragging the mop through a smear of water near the bottom step. In a matter of seconds, she would not see him. Not truly, not in any way that mattered. She was 4 steps from the lobby floor when Derek Mitchell, the company's chief financial officer, moved past Marcus's yellow caution sign and kicked it aside with the edge of his polished shoe. The movement was casual, almost absent-minded, the kind of thing a person does when they are thinking about something else entirely. The sign skidded 3 feet across the marble and wedged itself against the reception desk. Victoria's heel caught the damp marble, and her body lurched sideways. She did not fall. Her hand found the stair rail in time, and she recovered in under a second, spine straight, expression sealed, but a vice president had already moved toward her, and the half-breath of alarm from the crowd was loud enough in that silence to leave a mark. Victoria absorbed it all. In the controlled world she had built since inheriting the company, a witnessed stumble registered as an injury. She turned toward the sound of the cartwheels before she turned toward Marcus. Her gaze locked onto the mop, the bucket, the strip of floor that had not yet dried. The yellow warning sign sat wedged against the reception desk several feet away, moved there by Derek, though none of that registered. "You." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. "Do you know what day this is?" Marcus straightened slowly and looked at her. He recognized her immediately. Everyone who worked in the building did. "I do." "Then explain to me why this floor is still wet in the middle of a memorial event. The warning sign was moved by—" "I'm not asking about a sign." She took one step closer. "I'm asking about your job, which apparently you are not doing." The lobby had gone still in the way it does when powerful people perform power, and everyone else waits to see who survives it. A few managers studied the floor. No one spoke. Marcus held the mop handle. His knuckles did not whiten. He did not look away. He was a man who had buried his wife, raised a child alone through 4 winters of medical bills and sleepless nights, and logged 10,000 hours of unglamorous labor in buildings like this one. He knew which battles deserved his voice. This was not one of them. Not because he was weak, because he had seen what losing dignity looks like, and he refused to lose his own. "You're terminated," Victoria said. "Effective immediately." The words landed clean and final, the way a door sounds when it shuts in a hallway that has already gone quiet. Marcus set the mop handle against the cart. He reached up, unpinned the badge that read, "Marcus Webb, Facilities," and placed it on the supply cart with the same care he gave everything. Then he looked at her directly, and when he spoke his voice was so even it was almost difficult to hear. "I understand. But there are things about your father you've never been told." Victoria studied him for a moment with something that might have been curiosity if she had let it. She didn't. She turned away. Marcus walked toward the service corridor without looking back, his cart rolling quietly beside him, carrying his gloves, his cleaning solution, and an entire life that had just been severed without warning or ceremony. Behind him, the whispers began. A few were sympathetic. Most were simply relieved it hadn't been them. Tom Garrison stood near the security desk, jaw tight. He had seen Derek move the sign. He had seen the whole thing unfold. But he said nothing. He had a mortgage and 2 kids in college, and he knew what happened to people who contradicted executives in public. The locker room in the facilities wing was the kind of space that existed in every building but appeared in none of the brochures. Institutional lighting, metal lockers with combination locks that stuck in winter, a folding chair in the corner no one had replaced since the previous decade. Margaret Torres was already there, already aware. She was 61, had worked at Ashford for 17 years, and had the quiet authority of someone who had survived every management restructuring the company had ever attempted. She looked at Marcus and said nothing for a beat. "I heard." "Don't worry about it," Marcus said. "She can't just—" "She can," he said, not unkindly. "Don't make trouble for yourself over this. I mean it." He pulled his jacket from the locker and folded his uniform top carefully before placing it on the shelf. The photograph of Lily he tucked into his inner pocket first, before anything else. Margaret pressed her lips together in the way people do when they are holding in something they know won't help. "You've worked here longer than half those executives have been in the industry." Marcus looked at her and allowed himself a small, sad version of a smile. "That doesn't mean what it should. But thank you." He left through the service exit into the gray winter morning. He found his car, a 9-year-old sedan with a cracked dashboard pad and a child's drawing taped to the glove compartment, and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. He did the math the way he always did, the immediate and unforgiving arithmetic of a man with a dependent. Lily's prescription needed refilling by Thursday. The building manager at their apartment on Dorchester Avenue had sent a message 2 days ago, polite but pointed, about the upcoming rent cycle. He did not allow himself the luxury of anger. Not at Victoria directly. Anger at a person who had never truly seen you was too expensive. He saved his energy for the things in front of him. He reached into the glove compartment for the pharmacy paperwork and found beneath it a cream-colored envelope he had set aside 3 days ago. It carried the letterhead of Patterson and Associates, the private legal firm that had managed Robert Ashford's personal affairs for 20 years. He had not opened it, assuming it was some administrative notice related to the building's service contracts. His phone buzzed. A text message from the same firm. Mr. Marcus Webb, please be present at Ashford Industries executive floor, Suite 42, at 12:30 this afternoon. This is required per the terms of a standing directive in the estate of Mr. Robert Ashford. Marcus read it twice. Then he set the phone face down on the passenger seat. He stared through the windshield at the gray concrete wall of the parking structure. His expression was not entirely calm, but it was not what surprise usually looks like either. He started the engine. 3.5 years earlier, Marcus had been finishing a late maintenance shift at a medical services facility connected to Massachusetts General Hospital. The job had been different then, smaller, quieter. He had been cutting through the lower parking level on his way to his own car when he saw a man in an expensive coat sitting on the concrete between two vehicles, breathing badly. Marcus had called emergency services immediately, kept the man talking, and positioned him in a way that a first responder would later confirm had reduced the risk significantly. The man had been able to speak by the time the paramedics arrived. He had looked at Marcus, this man in work clothes who had stopped and stayed without any reason beyond the fact that someone needed him, and said with some difficulty, "Don't tell anyone you saw me here." Marcus had looked at him for a moment. "Okay," and he meant it. He meant it the next morning when the facility administrator mentioned an incident in the parking structure and Marcus said nothing. He meant it the following week and for 3.5 years after that. He had not told his supervisors. He had not told Margaret. He had not told Sarah in the months she had remaining. He had kept his word to a stranger because he had given it, and because he was the kind of man who did not negotiate with his own promises. What Marcus had not known was that Robert Ashford had spent the months following that night quietly investigating him. Not intrusively. Simply the way a man watches when he wants to be certain his instinct about another person is not sentimental. Robert had learned that Marcus Webb had served 4 years as an Army medic, honorably discharged. That he had worked as a systems analyst at an Ashford Logistics satellite facility in Worcester, where his performance record was marked consistently by precision and integrity. That he had flagged potential compliance issues twice when staying silent would have been easier. That he had declined a bonus allocation after discovering the figures had been misrepresented and filed the discrepancy instead. When Sarah received her diagnosis, Marcus had requested a lateral transfer, not a leave of absence, but a move to a lower pressure position that freed him to drive her to treatments 3 mornings a week. He had asked for nothing beyond the transfer itself. He had simply rearranged his life around what mattered and said nothing about it. Robert Ashford had also learned, though Marcus would never know this part, that the night in the parking garage had not been a coincidence of location. Sarah had been receiving treatment 2 floors above, in the cancer ward. Marcus had just left her bedside to get coffee when he found Robert collapsed. He had chosen to help a stranger even when his dying wife was waiting for him. When Robert had later asked, through an intermediary, why Marcus had stopped, the answer had come back simple and unadorned. "She would have wanted me to." Robert had read that line and understood what kind of man Marcus Webb was. Not the kind who performed goodness when it was convenient. The kind who practiced it when no one was watching. Through an anonymous fund administered by Patterson and Associates, Robert had ensured that Lily's asthma medications were covered for the entirety of the time since Sarah's death. Marcus had believed it was a community health grant. He had been grateful for it in the private way of someone who has learned not to question mercy. The 42nd floor of Ashford Industries was not a place that tolerated ambiguity. The boardroom there, mahogany paneling, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the Charles River, A conference table so long and reflective it seemed to double everything placed on its surface had been designed to make people feel the weight of consequence before a single word was spoken. By 12:15 the room held 9 people. Victoria sat at the head of the table, composed in the way of someone who had been composing herself since childhood. To her left was a pair of directors she had inherited from her father's original council, men in their 60s, who had been quietly testing the edges of her authority since Robert's death. To her right was Derek Mitchell, silver at the temples, the kind of man whose loyalty was always performing and never quite arriving. Along the table's length sat 2 institutional shareholders, a legal compliance officer, and an outside board member who had flown in from Chicago. At the far end, setting a leather portfolio on the table with the deliberateness of someone who understood ceremony, was George Patterson. George Patterson had been Robert Ashford's personal attorney for 23 years. He was 70, thin and unhurried, with the particular calm of someone who has spent decades watching powerful people discover that the future does not ask their permission. "We're here for the final reading," he said as the room settled. Victoria had attended the preliminary readings already. The real estate holdings, the personal accounts, the philanthropic endowments. She had expected this session to be administrative, perhaps a final charitable directive, a few legacy designations, nothing that would alter the operational picture. "Mr. Patterson," said one of the elder directors, "how long do you anticipate this taking?" "As long as it requires." George opened with the expected clauses. Incremental share distributions to council members, a memorial lecture series at Robert's alma mater, a deferred compensation arrangement for 2 long-tenured department heads. Derek made small notations on a yellow legal pad, his pen moving in the precise, minimal strokes of a man who trusted nothing until it was in writing. Then George turned to a new section. He adjusted his glasses. "There is one remaining clause which Robert specifically directed be read in full before the complete executive council and family representatives, and only after the 1st anniversary of his death had passed. This clause involves a disposition of personal shares and a voting rights instrument. Robert required that the person named in this section be present for its reading." He looked toward the door. A young assistant stepped in and murmured something. George nodded. "Please send him in." Victoria looked up. A clause she had not been told about. She felt something sharpen in her chest. Not quite alarm, but its quieter predecessor. The silence that preceded the reading of that name was the kind that fills a room not because nothing is happening, but because something is about to. George removed his glasses, polished the lens with the deliberateness of a man who had rehearsed this moment not for drama, but out of respect for its weight. He replaced them. He looked at the document and briefly at the room. Under Clause 7 of the final personal testament of Robert Raymond Ashford, the following disposition takes effect immediately upon public reading. The named individual shall receive 18% of Robert Ashford's personal holdings in Ashford Industries, along with a protective voting instrument applicable to specific categories of board decision as outlined in the accompanying legal schedule. Derek stopped writing. One of the elder directors shifted in his chair. The compliance officer looked at her papers, then at George, then at her papers again. "The individual named in this clause is Mr. Marcus Webb." 2 seconds of silence. Not the polite silence of people digesting expected information. The stunned silence of a room in which the architecture of reality has just shifted without warning. Victoria's head came up slowly. She had heard the name clearly, and the particular configuration of those 2 words, Marcus Webb, landed in her mind with the quality of a memory she had not known she was carrying. The man in the Navy uniform, the cart wheels, the badge she had watched him remove with both hands and set on the supply cart like something fragile. "I'm sorry," said one of the directors, his voice thin with the effort of remaining controlled. "Could you repeat that?" George repeated it without elaboration, without apology, without any of the softening that might have made it easier to dismiss. Victoria said nothing. She was too precise a person to speak into a silence she did not yet understand, but her fingers pressed flat against the table surface had gone white at the tips. Derek set down his pen. Is there any possibility of a clerical error? None. This document was signed, notarized, and sealed 14 months ago prior to Robert's final hospitalization. The firm has verified it against all parallel instruments. There is no error. The door at the end of the room opened. Marcus Webb walked in. He was still wearing the Navy maintenance uniform because he had come directly from the parking structure and there had been no time or reason to change. The soles of his work shoes were clean. He had wiped them at the corridor entrance out of habit, but everything else about his appearance announced without apology exactly what his morning had been. He stopped near the foot of the table, looked at the room with an expression that was careful rather than nervous, and waited. Victoria looked at his face, which was the same face that had looked back at her in the lobby 4 hours ago with an equanimity she had mistaken for submission. The room waited for someone to speak. No one was certain who had the authority anymore. Marcus did not take a seat. No one offered him one, and he did not ask. He stood near the end of the table with the same posture he had held in the lobby, back straight, hands at his sides, weight distributed evenly. He had spent years learning how to occupy space without apology and without aggression, and the skill showed. Victoria recovered first because she was practiced at recovery. "I'd like someone to explain the nature of this arrangement." Her gaze was directed at George rather than at Marcus. "The nature will be explained in full." Robert prepared a detailed written account addressing both the legal basis and the personal reasoning behind the clause. "He asked that I read it in this room before everyone present." She turned finally to look directly at Marcus. "Did you know about this?" "Not the details. I knew your father had asked me to come today. I didn't know why. You said something when you left this morning." He met her eyes. "I said there were things about your father you hadn't been told. That was true before I knew any of this." The admission hung in the air between them without expanding into accusation. George cleared his throat. "With the council's permission, and given that the named party is now present, I'll proceed with the supplemental record." He opened a second section of the portfolio. "Robert prepared this over the course of several months. I'll summarize the essential points and read the letter in full where directed." The room listened. What George laid out over the next several minutes was not the story of a transaction. It was the story of a man who had been paying close and quiet attention for years to someone the rest of the organization had decided was invisible. The summary began with Marcus's employment history. Before becoming a facilities technician, he had been a systems analyst at an Ashford Logistics satellite facility in Worcester. His performance record was marked consistently by precision and integrity. He had flagged potential compliance issues twice when staying silent would have been easier. He had declined a bonus allocation after discovering the figures had been misrepresented and filed the discrepancy instead. When Sarah received her diagnosis, Marcus had requested a lateral transfer, not a leave of absence, but a move to a lower pressure position that freed him to drive her to treatments 3 mornings a week. He had asked for nothing beyond the transfer itself. He had simply rearranged his life around what mattered and said nothing about it. The night that changed Robert Ashford's understanding of Marcus Webb had happened 3.5 years earlier in the lower parking structure of Massachusetts General Hospital. Robert had driven himself that evening, dismissed the driver, told no one where he was going. He had been undergoing cardiac monitoring quietly, under a name that was not his own. The checkup had not gone the way he hoped. He made it to his car. He did not make it out of the parking structure. He was found on the concrete between his car door and the hood of the vehicle next to it, conscious but unable to stand, his chest tightening in the particular way that becomes indistinguishable from certainty. Marcus Webb found him. Marcus had been finishing a late maintenance shift at a medical services facility connected to the hospital complex. He was cutting through the lower level on the way to his own car when he saw a man in an expensive coat sitting on the ground between 2 vehicles, breathing badly. He called emergency services immediately, kept the man talking, and positioned him in a way that a first responder would later confirm had reduced the risk significantly. Robert had been able to speak by the time the paramedics arrived. He had looked at Marcus, This man in work clothes who had stopped and stayed without any reason beyond the fact that someone needed him and said with some difficulty, "Don't tell anyone you saw me here." Marcus had looked at him for a moment. Okay. And he meant it. He meant it the next morning when the facility administrator mentioned an incident in the parking structure and Marcus said nothing. He meant it the following week and for 3.5 years after that. He had not told his supervisors. He had not told Margaret. He had not told Sarah in the months she had remaining. He had kept his word to a stranger because he had given it and because he was the kind of man who did not negotiate with his own promises. George paused and let that sit. Derek had stopped all pretense of note-taking. The compliance officer was looking at the table. Victoria was looking at Marcus. George continued. Several months after that night, Robert's security team identified an unusual pattern of internal data access queries running against confidential records, suggesting someone was constructing a profile of the chairman for purposes that were not internal. The source was traced to a server node at the Worcester satellite facility. The person who had first flagged the anomaly in a routine report he had almost certainly not known would matter was Marcus Webb. He had noticed the discrepancy during a standard system audit and submitted it through the compliance channel because that was what the protocol said to do. He did not know what it pertained to. He had simply done his job with the kind of thoroughness that does not distinguish between high stakes and low stakes because it operates on principle rather than consequence. Robert had read the flag report. He had connected the name. After that, without Marcus's knowledge, Robert had watched. Not intrusively. Simply the way a man watches when he wants to be certain his instinct about another person is not sentimental. He watched Marcus decline a quiet financial assistance offer after Sarah's death because Marcus did not want to carry a debt of gratitude that would change the nature of what he had already done. He watched Marcus drive Lily to appointments on mornings that began before sunrise. He watched Marcus work 2 jobs without complaint, without drama, without a word to anyone about what he deserved. And through an anonymous fund administered by Patterson and Associates, Robert had ensured that Lily's asthma medications were covered for the entirety of that time. Marcus had believed it was a community health grant. He had been grateful for it in the private way of someone who has learned not to question mercy. George closed the supplemental record. Robert's final notation on this section reads as follows. I did not give this to Marcus Webb because he saved my life. I gave it because after saving it, he still chose to do the right thing when no one was watching. That is rarer than courage. That is character. The second envelope had been sitting on the table in front of George since the reading began. Cream-colored, sealed with a wax emboss, and labeled in Robert Ashford's own handwriting. To be opened when Victoria has seen Marcus Webb. George broke the seal without ceremony and unfolded 2 handwritten pages. The room waited. He read Robert's letter aloud, and as he did, the formal language of legal proceedings fell entirely away. What remained was the voice of a man writing to his daughter from a place past the reach of her arguments. Robert began by saying he was proud of her. Specifically, not performatively. Her intelligence, her discipline, the way she absorbed pressure that would have fractured most people. He had watched her inherit the hardest parts of himself and felt, more than once, the particular pride of a parent who recognizes their own worst instincts in a child they love completely. And then he said the thing that made the room go still. He wrote that the great risk of intelligence combined with authority is the belief that people without power do not merit the same precision of attention we give to spreadsheets and strategy. He wrote that he had built Ashford Industries over 40 years, and the lesson he was most ashamed to have learned late was this. A company does not collapse from its first small failures. It collapses when the person at the top stops being able to see the full humanity of the people below them. He wrote, "The floors do not stay clean because of the machines. They stay clean because someone arrives before dawn and does the work carefully and goes home tired and comes back the next morning. If you have forgotten that, you have forgotten where everything you hold actually comes from." And then the line that George read slowly, deliberately, with the practiced restraint of a man who understood the weight of words. If you look down on Marcus Webb because of the uniform he was wearing, then you do not yet understand dignity. And if you do not understand dignity, you do not yet fully understand me. The room was completely silent. Victoria sat at the head of the table with her hands folded in front of her and her face arranged into a composure that was costing her something visible. The words had not found her in the way of outside criticism. They had found her in the way of a mirror held up at an angle she had not anticipated by a hand she trusted beyond all others. Her father had written this knowing. He had known the test would come, that she would fail it, and that she would need to hear the truth from him rather than from anyone who might be accused of having a grievance. Marcus stood at the end of the table. He had not moved. His expression was not triumphant and not wounded. It was the expression of a man who has been seen at last and doesn't quite know yet what to do with that. The letter ended with a single final line. If Marcus is still willing to stand in the same room as you after what you've done, learn from him. If he is not, learn from that too. The silence after George folded the letter lasted long enough that it began to feel intentional. Then Victoria stood up. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was the slow, unsteady rising of someone who has been sitting too long under the weight of a realization that cannot be deferred any further. She did not straighten her jacket or align her posture. She looked at Marcus from the length of the table, and for the first time since his shift had begun that morning, looked at him without the architecture of rank between them. "I owe you an apology." Her voice was even, but it cost her something to keep it that way. "What I said this morning, how I said it, and where, and who was listening, was wrong. Not a procedural error. Wrong." Marcus watched her without responding immediately. "I made a judgment about who you were based on what I could see in about 4 seconds, and I was wrong about that too." She stopped. She had practiced being articulate in boardrooms her entire adult life, and she found now that she had no polished version of this available. That was perhaps the point. "I can't undo what I did. I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. But I want you to know that I understand the difference between those two things." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with the same steadiness he had brought into that room, unchanged by everything that had transpired over the last hour. "I appreciate that. But I want to be clear about something. I'm not here because of the shares. I'm not here because your father's letter finally makes me legible to the people in this room." He let that land before continuing. "I'm here because I was asked to be. And now that I'm here, I have one thing I care about saying." The room gave him its full attention. "There are people in this building who came in before you this morning, and they'll be here after you leave tonight. They clean the elevators and fix the heating and drive the deliveries and empty the bins. Most of them have families. Some of them have sick kids. All of them did their jobs this morning without being thanked for it or even noticed." He paused. "That's not an accusation. It's just what's true, and I think it ought to change." Derek began to say something about the practicalities of policy revision. Marcus looked at him, just looked. Derek did not finish the sentence. George spoke from his end of the table. "I should note for the record that under the terms of the protective voting instrument, any action that would diminish or circumvent Mr. Webb's standing in this organization requires unanimous council approval, which cannot be compelled." He said this without emphasis. He did not need to. The room understood. The man in the maintenance uniform was not a guest. He had never been one. Marcus left the boardroom 20 minutes later. After George had answered the procedural questions the board members needed addressed before they could process what had actually happened. Victoria did not follow him. She remained in her chair, staring at the polished surface of the table, while the others filed out in subdued clusters. Derek was the last to leave. He paused at the door, looked back at her, and said nothing. The expression on his face was unreadable, but it was not benign. When the room was empty, Victoria opened her laptop and began drafting an email to the head of Human Resources. She got 3 sentences in and stopped. The words felt false, performative, a gesture made to smooth over what could not be smoothed. She closed the laptop. She sat in the silence of the boardroom and allowed herself, for the first time since her father's funeral, to cry. Marcus drove back to his apartment in Dorchester through mid-afternoon traffic that moved in stuttering intervals. He had not eaten since breakfast. His hands were steady on the wheel, but his mind was working through calculations that had nothing to do with money. Lily would be home from school in 2 hours. Margaret had agreed to stay until he returned, but he had not told her what the meeting was about, only that it was required, and he would explain later. The apartment was small, 3rd floor, with a narrow staircase that creaked on the 7th step. Lily's drawings covered the refrigerator. A stack of medical bills sat on the kitchen counter, organized by due date. Marcus set his keys on the table and stood in the center of the living room, looking at the space as though seeing it for the first time. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. Margaret arrived at 4:30 with Lily, who ran through the door with her backpack bouncing and her jacket half off. "Dad, we made volcanoes in science today and mine exploded the best." Marcus knelt down and pulled her into a hug that lasted longer than usual. She smelled like chalk dust and the strawberry shampoo she insisted on using. "That's great, sweetheart. Did you use your inhaler at lunch?" Lily nodded, already distracted by something she wanted to show him in her backpack. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching him with the careful attention of someone who knows when something fundamental has shifted. "Everything all right?" Marcus stood up, one hand still resting on Lily's shoulder. "I don't know yet, but I'll tell you when I do." Margaret left without pressing further. Marcus made dinner, helped Lily with her homework, and sat with her on the couch while she watched a nature documentary about penguins. When she fell asleep against his arm, he carried her to her bed, tucked the blanket around her, and kissed her forehead. Then he walked into his own bedroom, closed the door, and sat on the edge of the bed with his head in his hands. The photograph of Sarah on the nightstand had been taken 6 months before her diagnosis. She was laughing at something off camera, her hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes bright with the kind of joy that exists only when a person does not yet know what is coming. Marcus picked up the frame and held it in both hands. "He's giving me a chance to change our lives, Sarah. But taking it feels like I'm pretending to be something I'm not." He sat there for a long time, waiting for an answer that would not come. Then he set the photograph down, changed into jeans and a clean shirt, and drove to Cedar Grove Cemetery on the outskirts of the city. The graves were arranged in neat rows under oak trees that had been planted decades before any of the people buried there were born. Sarah's headstone was simple, gray granite with her name and the years that bookended her life. Marcus knelt in the grass beside it and spoke quietly. "I promised you I'd teach Lily that dignity isn't about what you own. It's about how you treat people when no one's watching. I've been trying to keep that promise, but now I don't know if accepting this inheritance is breaking it or honoring it." The wind moved through the branches overhead. A crow called from somewhere in the distance. "He gave me the shares because he thought I deserved them. But I keep thinking about all the people in that building who deserve the same chance and won't get it. I keep thinking about what you'd want me to do." He stayed there until the light began to fade, then stood, brushed the grass from his knees, and drove home. When he walked into the apartment, Lily was awake again, sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of water and her inhaler beside her. "Dad, are you okay?" Marcus sat down across from her. "Yeah, Lil, I'm okay, just figuring some things out." She looked at him with the unnerving directness that 8-year-olds sometimes possess. "Is it about the man who died? The one whose building you work at?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "He left me something in his will, something important, and I have to decide what to do with it." Lily considered this. Was he nice? Marcus thought about the man in the parking garage, struggling to breathe, asking for silence instead of help. I think he was trying to be. The next morning, Marcus received a phone call from George Patterson's office requesting a follow-up meeting to discuss the administrative details of the inheritance. Marcus agreed to come in at 2. He spent the morning cleaning the apartment, doing laundry, and replacing the air filter in Lily's nebulizer. At 1:30, he put on the same jeans and button-down shirt he had worn to the cemetery and drove back into the city. George's office was on the 14th floor of a building 3 blocks from Ashford Industries. The reception area was understated, wood paneling and leather chairs, the kind of place that announced its competence by refusing to perform it. George met him at the door to his private office and gestured toward a chair. "Thank you for coming, Marcus. I know yesterday was a lot to absorb." Marcus sat down. "I'm still absorbing it." George opened a folder on his desk and began walking through the practical mechanics of the inheritance. Tax implications, voting procedures, dividend schedules. Marcus listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, and made notes on a legal pad George had provided. Halfway through the explanation, George paused and looked at him directly. "Robert left instructions for me to give you this once we'd covered the basics." He handed Marcus a sealed envelope, smaller than the one that had been read in the boardroom. Marcus's name was written on the front in Robert's handwriting. He opened it carefully and unfolded a single page. The letter was brief. There was, "Marcus, by the time you read this, you'll know what I've done. I expect you're wondering why. The answer is simple. Because you're the only person I've met in 40 years who doesn't want anything from me. That makes you dangerous in the best possible way. My daughter is brilliant, but she's inherited my worst habits along with my best ones. She needs someone in that boardroom who won't let her forget what matters. I trust you to be that person. Not because you owe me, because that's who you are. Use the shares however you see fit. Just don't let her turn into me." Marcus read it twice, then folded it and put it back in the envelope. He knew she'd fire me. George nodded. He was counting on it. The whole arrangement was designed to teach her a lesson she couldn't learn any other way. Marcus leaned back in his chair. "That's a hell of a thing to do to your own daughter." George's expression softened slightly. Robert loved her more than anything. That's why he did it. He knew she'd be angry. He knew she'd feel betrayed. But he also knew she'd understand eventually. And he knew you wouldn't use the power he gave you to humiliate her. Marcus thought about Victoria's face in the boardroom, the way her hands had pressed flat against the table, the careful control that had cost her everything to maintain. "I'm not interested in humiliating anyone. I just want to make sure the people who keep that building running aren't invisible anymore." George smiled. "Then you're exactly the person Robert thought you were." Marcus left George's office with a folder full of documents and a head full of questions he could not yet answer. He picked Lily up from school, took her for ice cream at a shop on Dorchester Avenue, and listened to her talk about a girl in her class who had brought a hamster for show and tell. When they got home, he helped her with her math homework, made dinner, and put her to bed. Then he sat at the kitchen table with the folder open in front of him and began working through the numbers. The dividend projections were staggering, more money than he had earned in the last 10 years combined, enough to pay off every bill, move to a better apartment, put Lily in a private school with a nurse on staff, enough to stop working nights, to sleep in unbroken hours, to stop doing the arithmetic of survival every time he opened his wallet. And it felt wrong, not the money itself, the idea of keeping it. He thought about Margaret, who had worked at Ashford for 17 years and still worried about whether her granddaughter could afford the surgery she needed. He thought about Tom, who had 2 kids in college and a mortgage he joked about paying off before he died. He thought about every person he had worked alongside who showed up before dawn and left after dark and never complained because complaining was a luxury reserved for people with options. By midnight, he had made his decision. He pulled out a yellow legal pad and began writing. 3 days later, Marcus received a call from Derek Mitchell's assistant requesting an emergency board meeting. The message was polite but firm. Marcus agreed to attend. He arrived at Ashford Industries at 9 in the morning, wearing the same jeans and button-down shirt, carrying the yellow legal pad under his arm. The boardroom was already full when he walked in. Victoria sat at the head of the table. Derek was to her right, flanked by the 2 elder directors. The institutional shareholders were present, along with the compliance officer and the outside board member from Chicago. Derek stood as Marcus entered. "Mr. Webb, thank you for coming. We've prepared a proposal we'd like to discuss with you." Marcus sat down at the foot of the table and set the legal pad in front of him. "I'm listening." Derek slid a bound document across the table. "We understand that yesterday's revelations were unexpected. We also understand that managing an 18% stake in a company of this size requires expertise you may not currently possess. To that end, the board has authorized a buyout offer. $5 million, paid in full within 30 days. You would retain no ongoing obligations or liabilities. It's a generous package, and we believe it's in everyone's best interest. Marcus did not touch the document. He looked at Derek, then at the elder directors, then at Victoria. Her face was carefully neutral, but there was something in her eyes that might have been curiosity or might have been caution. I appreciate the offer, but I'm not interested. Derek's smile tightened. Mr. Webb, I don't think you understand the complexities involved in— I understand fine. I'm not interested in a buyout. One of the elder directors leaned forward. Then what are you interested in? Marcus opened the yellow legal pad and set it on the table where everyone could see. The handwriting was neat, precise, the kind that comes from years of filling out maintenance logs and incident reports. I want to establish a fund, the Robert and Sarah Webb Memorial Fund. Every dollar of dividend income from my 18% stake goes into it. The fund provides medical coverage, educational support, and emergency financial assistance to the children of Ashford employees in operational roles, maintenance, logistics, security, food services, transportation, facilities management. He paused. Kids shouldn't pay for their parents' position in a hierarchy they didn't choose. If this company wants to claim it, values the people who keep it running, it should prove that where it's hardest to argue with. The pharmacy counter, the school enrollment office, the pediatric specialist's waiting room. The room was silent. Derek recovered first. This is fiscally irresponsible. The board has a fiduciary duty to— I'm not asking the board to fund it, I'm funding it, with my dividends. The only thing I need from this room is approval to set it up under the company's charitable structure. Victoria spoke for the first time. I support this. Derek turned to her. Victoria, we need to think about the precedent this sets. I support it, fully, and I'll match the initial capital from my personal allocation. The elder directors exchanged glances. The compliance officer made a note. The outside board member from Chicago nodded slowly. Derek's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Victoria looked at Marcus across the length of the table, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the letter her father had written in the months before he died. The board voted. The fund was approved. Marcus left the building 20 minutes later with a commitment letter and a timeline for the first round of applications. He sat in his car in the parking garage and called Margaret. I need to tell you something. He explained everything. The will, the shares, the fund. Margaret was silent for a long time. Marcus, do you know what you just did? I think so. Her voice cracked slightly. You just saved my granddaughter's life. Marcus closed his eyes. I'm glad, Margaret. I'm really glad. He drove home and found Lily sitting on the couch with her inhaler in her lap, breathing slowly, carefully. He sat down beside her and pulled her close. How are you feeling? She leaned into him. Better. Are you still figuring things out? Marcus kissed the top of her head. Yeah, but I think I'm getting there. The story broke 2 days later. Someone in the boardroom, almost certainly Derek, had leaked the details to the Boston Globe. The headline read, Janitor inherits fortune, gives it all away. The article framed it as a human interest story, the kind of feel-good narrative that made people believe in the possibility of goodness without requiring them to interrogate the systems that made such gestures necessary in the first place. Marcus's phone rang constantly. Reporters wanted interviews. Local news stations wanted to send cameras to his apartment. A producer from a morning talk show left 3 voicemails. Marcus ignored all of it. He went to work at his second job, the office tower 3 miles east, and cleaned floors until his shift ended at 10. He came home, checked on Lily, and went to bed. But the attention did not stop. By the end of the week, photographers were camped outside his apartment. Lily came home from school upset because other kids had been asking her questions she didn't know how to answer. Marcus called Margaret and asked if Lily could stay with her for a few days until things calmed down. Margaret agreed immediately. That night, alone in the apartment, Marcus sat at the kitchen table and read through the news coverage. Most of it was positive, celebratory even, but there was an undertone he recognized. The story was being shaped into something it wasn't. He was being turned into a symbol, a convenient narrative about humility and sacrifice that made people feel good without challenging them to change anything. And then the second story dropped. The headline was different this time. Janitor fraud. Ashford heir's secret past. The article claimed that Marcus had falsified his military service record, that he had been dishonorably discharged for theft, that the entire narrative of his integrity was built on lies. Attached to the online version were scanned documents, VA paperwork with Marcus's name and service number, discharge codes that indicated criminal conduct. Marcus read the article 3 times. His hands did not shake. He picked up his phone and called George Patterson. "I need you to see something." He forwarded the article. George called back within 10 minutes. "These documents are fake." "I know." George was quiet for a moment. "This is a coordinated attack. Someone wants you discredited before the fund launches." Marcus thought about Derek's face in the boardroom, the way his smile had tightened when the buyout offer was refused. "Can you prove they're fake? Give me 24 hours. Marcus hung up and sat in the silence of the apartment. His phone buzzed with text messages. Friends asking if the story was true. Former co-workers expressing disbelief. A reporter asking for comment. He turned the phone off. At 11:30 there was a knock at the door. Marcus opened it to find Victoria standing in the hallway. She was not dressed for work. She wore jeans and a jacket he had never seen before, and her hair was down. She looked tired. "I saw the article." Marcus stepped aside to let her in. She walked into the living room and looked around, taking in the small space, the drawings on the refrigerator, the stack of medical bills on the counter. "It's not true, is it?" "No," she nodded. "I didn't think so, but I needed to hear you say it." Marcus sat down on the couch. Victoria sat in the chair across from him. "I hired someone, a forensic investigator. He's already confirmed the documents are forged. The IP address traces back to Ashford's internal network." Marcus looked at her. "You think it was Derek?" "I know it was Derek. I just need to prove it in a way the board can't ignore." "Why are you doing this?" Victoria leaned forward, elbows on her knees. "Because my father was right. I've been leading this company for a year, and I've been doing it the way I thought he would have wanted. Control, precision, intolerance for error. But that's not what he wanted at all. He wanted me to see people the way he did, to value them the way he did. And I didn't. Not until you walked into that boardroom." She paused. "I can't undo firing you. I can't undo the humiliation, but I can make sure Derek doesn't destroy you the way he's trying to." Marcus studied her for a moment. "This is going to cost you." Victoria smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "Good. It should." She stood to leave, then stopped at the door. "Where's Lily?" "With a friend. I didn't want her here while the photographers were outside." Victoria's expression softened. "I'll make sure they're gone by tomorrow." She left. Marcus sat alone in the apartment and thought about the letter Robert had written, the line about not letting Victoria turn into him. He wondered if Robert had known how hard that lesson would be to learn. He wondered if he had known how much it would cost both of them. The next morning, Marcus's phone rang at 6. It was George. "I have the proof." The investigator traced the forgery to an assistant in Derek's office. "She's willing to testify in exchange for immunity. Victoria's calling an emergency board meeting for 9. Marcus hung up and sat on the edge of the bed. His hands were steady. He got dressed, made coffee, and drove to Ashford Industries. The photographers were gone. The lobby was quiet. He took the elevator to the 42nd floor and walked into the boardroom at 8:55. Victoria was already there, along with George and the compliance officer. Derek arrived at 9, flanked by the elder directors. The institutional shareholders joined by video conference. The room settled into a tense silence. Victoria did not waste time. We're here to address a matter of internal misconduct. Evidence has come to light that documents used to smear Marcus Webb were fabricated and distributed with the intent to damage his reputation and undermine the memorial fund. Derek's face remained neutral. That's a serious accusation. Victoria slid a folder across the table. The forensic report is conclusive. The documents were created on a computer in your office. Your assistant has provided a sworn statement that you instructed her to fabricate them. Derek opened the folder, scanned the contents, and closed it again. This is a setup. She's lying to save herself. George spoke from the far end of the table. We have email metadata, IP logs, and timestamps. The evidence is irrefutable. One of the elder directors looked at Derek. Is there anything you'd like to say? Derek stood up. I've served this company for 12 years. I'm not going to sit here and be railroaded by a janitor and a CEO who's forgotten what leadership looks like. Victoria's voice was cold. The board will vote. Those in favor of Derek Mitchell's immediate termination? Every hand went up. Derek looked around the room, his face tight with barely controlled fury. Then he picked up his briefcase and walked out without another word. The room exhaled. Victoria looked at Marcus. It's done. Marcus nodded. He did not feel victorious. He felt tired. The meeting ended. Marcus left the building and drove to Margaret's house to pick up Lily. She ran to him when he walked through the door, wrapping her arms around his waist. Dad, I missed you. Marcus held her for a long time. I missed you too, Lil. They drove home together. Lily talked about the book Margaret had been reading to her, something about a girl who could talk to animals. Marcus listened and felt the weight of the last week begin to lift. Not entirely, but enough. That night, after Lily was asleep, Marcus sat at the kitchen table and opened his laptop. There was an email from George with the finalized documents for the memorial fund. The first round of applications would open in 2 weeks. Marcus read through the criteria, the eligibility requirements, the process for review. It was real. It was happening. He closed the laptop and walked to Lily's room. She was asleep, her breathing steady, the inhaler on the nightstand beside her. Marcus stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment, then turned and went back to the kitchen. He sat down, opened the yellow legal pad, and began writing a letter to Sarah. He wrote about Robert, about Victoria, about the fund. He wrote about the fear he still carried, the uncertainty about whether he was doing the right thing. He wrote until his hand cramped, and then he tore the pages out, folded them carefully, and tucked them into the envelope with her photograph. Outside, the city was quiet. Inside, Marcus Webb sat alone in the small apartment and allowed himself for the first time in years to believe that something better might be possible. 6 weeks passed before the Robert and Sarah Webb Memorial Fund officially opened its doors. The office was not located in Ashford Industries headquarters. Victoria had suggested a community center in Roxbury, a neighborhood where many of the company's operational staff lived. The space was small, 2 rooms with fluorescent lighting and linoleum floors, but it was clean and accessible, and it did not require anyone to walk through a corporate lobby to ask for help. Marcus spent the weeks leading up to the launch working with George Patterson to finalize the application process, review criteria, and approval workflows. He also spent 3 days a week back at Ashford Industries, not cleaning floors but sitting in meetings with department heads, learning the operational structure of the company in a way he had never needed to before. Victoria attended most of these meetings. She asked questions Marcus would not have thought to ask, and took notes in a leather-bound notebook that she carried everywhere. On a Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks before the fund's opening, Victoria stopped by Marcus's apartment unannounced. He answered the door in jeans and a t-shirt, a dish towel over his shoulder. Lily was at the kitchen table doing homework. I should have called first. Marcus stepped aside. It's fine, come in. Victoria walked into the living room and smiled at Lily, who looked up from her math worksheet and waved. Victoria waved back, then turned to Marcus. I wanted to talk to you about something. Privately, if possible. Marcus glanced at Lily, who had already returned her attention to her homework, then gestured toward the small balcony off the living room. They stepped outside into the cool evening air. The city stretched out below them, lights beginning to flicker on as dusk settled. "I've been thinking about the fund and about what happens after it launches." Marcus leaned against the railing. "What about it?" Victoria crossed her arms, not defensively, but as though holding something fragile inside herself. "I don't want this to be a one-time gesture. I don't want people to look at it and think, we did our good deed and moved on. I want it to change the way the company operates. Permanently. That's ambitious." She looked at him directly. "I need your help to do it. Not as a shareholder, as someone who understands what it's like to work in that building without power, without a voice. I need you to tell me what I'm not seeing." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "You're asking me to be a consultant?" "I'm asking you to be more than that. Chief People Officer. It's a new position. You'd design it however you want. The only requirement is that facility staff reports directly to you. No intermediaries, no bureaucracy." Marcus turned to face her. "I'm not qualified for that kind of role. You're more qualified than anyone else I could hire. You've lived what they're living. That's worth more than a degree." "What about the board? They're not going to approve." "They already did. Unanimously. George drafted the resolution yesterday." Marcus looked out at the city again, processing. "I'd still want to work in facilities. 2 days a week. Hands-on." Victoria nodded. "I was hoping you'd say that." Lily appeared in the doorway, holding her completed worksheet. "Dad, I'm done. Can I watch TV?" Marcus turned. "Half an hour, then bath time." Lily disappeared back inside. Victoria watched her go, then looked at Marcus. "She's lucky to have you. I'm the lucky one." They stood in silence for a moment, the distant hum of traffic filling the space between them. Victoria shifted her weight, and for the first time since he had met her, Marcus saw something uncertain in her posture. "I need to ask you something else." Marcus waited. "Do you think my father would be proud of what I'm doing? Or do you think he'd see it as me trying to fix a mistake I shouldn't have made in the first place?" Marcus thought about the letter Robert had written, the line about not letting Victoria turn into him. "I think he knew you'd make the mistake. That's why he set it up the way he did. But I also think he knew you'd learn from it. That's the part that would make him proud." Victoria's shoulders relaxed slightly. "Thank you." She left a few minutes later. Marcus stood on the balcony alone, watching her car pull out of the parking lot and disappear into the evening traffic. Then he went inside, helped Lily with her bath, and read her 2 chapters of the book about the girl who could talk to animals. When she was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table and stared at the paperwork George had sent over outlining the Chief People Officer role. The salary was more than he had made in the last 5 years combined. The benefits included health insurance that would cover Lily's medications without requiring anonymous grants or miracles. He signed the contract and scanned it back to George before he could talk himself out of it. The fund's opening day arrived on a Tuesday morning in late April. Marcus stood in the community center's front room, watching through the window as people began to arrive. Most of them were women, mothers and grandmothers who worked night shifts and double shifts and had taken time off to come here. They carried folders full of medical bills and school tuition notices and eviction warnings. They looked tired in the way people look when they have stopped hoping for help and come anyway because there is nothing left to lose. Margaret was there. She had driven in from her daughter's house in Quincy, bringing with her the paperwork for her granddaughter's heart surgery. The cost was $180,000. Insurance covered 60%. The rest was a wall Margaret had been staring at for 6 months, trying to figure out how to climb it. Victoria arrived at 9:30, not through the front door but through the back entrance, carrying a box of pastries from a bakery 3 blocks away. She set them on the table in the waiting area and began arranging them on paper plates. Marcus watched her work, this woman who 6 weeks ago would not have thought twice about the people now sitting in folding chairs, waiting for their names to be called. The first application they reviewed together was Margaret's. Marcus read through the documents while Victoria pulled up the fund's financial projections on her laptop. The surgery was scheduled for June 15th. The hospital required a deposit by May 1st. "Approved," Marcus said quietly. Victoria nodded and entered the information into the system. Then she stood, walked into the waiting area, and called Margaret's name. Margaret looked up, surprised to see Victoria instead of an administrator. She followed Victoria into the back room. Marcus stood and gestured for her to sit. "We've reviewed your granddaughter's application. The fund will cover the full balance of the surgery. You'll receive a confirmation letter by the end of the week with instructions for coordinating payment with the hospital." Margaret's hands went to her mouth. She did not cry, but her eyes filled and her voice broke when she spoke. "I don't know how to thank you." Marcus leaned forward. "You don't have to. That's the point." Margaret left 20 minutes later, carrying the confirmation paperwork and the knowledge that her granddaughter would live. Victoria watched her go, then turned to Marcus. "That's one. We have 146 more to process." They worked through lunch and into the evening. Each application was a story, a different configuration of the same fundamental problem. People who worked hard and still could not afford the basic machinery of survival. A maintenance worker whose son needed braces and speech therapy. A security guard whose daughter had been accepted to a charter school but could not afford the uniforms. A cook in the company cafeteria whose wife had MS and required medication that cost $4,000 a month. By the time they finished, it was past 8. Marcus locked the community center's doors and walked Victoria to her car. She leaned against the driver's side door, exhaustion visible in the set of her shoulders. "I didn't know it was this bad." Marcus looked at her. "It's always been this bad. You just didn't have to see it before." She nodded slowly. "My father saw it. That's why he did what he did. He saw you too. That's why he trusted you to figure it out." Victoria opened her car door, then paused. "I'm hosting a dinner next week. Small group. Board members, a few senior staff, some people from the fund's advisory committee. I'd like you to come. And bring Lily, if you're comfortable with that." Marcus hesitated. "I don't think that's—" "Please. I want people to see what this is really about. Not the PR, not the optics. The actual human beings we're helping." Marcus thought about Lily, who had never been to a dinner party in her life, who would probably be overwhelmed and anxious and need her inhaler halfway through. "I'll ask her. If she wants to come, we will." Lily was nervous the entire week leading up to the dinner. She tried on 3 different dresses Margaret had helped her pick out at a thrift store in Quincy, settling finally on a blue one with white flowers that she said made her feel like she was going to a wedding. Marcus wore a suit he had bought second-hand from a consignment shop in Cambridge. It fit well enough that no one would notice it had been worn by someone else first. Victoria's house was in Beacon Hill, a brownstone with ivy climbing the brick and gas lamps flanking the front door. Marcus parked on the street and walked up the steps with Lily's hand in his. She squeezed his fingers hard. "Dad, what if I say something wrong?" "You won't. But what if I do? Then we'll deal with it. Together." Victoria answered the door herself, wearing a dress that was elegant but not formal, her hair loose around her shoulders. She smiled when she saw Lily. "You must be Lily. I've heard so much about you." Lily looked up at her father, uncertain. Marcus nodded. Lily turned back to Victoria. "Thank you for inviting us." Victoria stepped aside to let them in. The interior was exactly what Marcus had expected. High ceilings, hardwood floors, furniture that looked expensive because it was old rather than new. But there were also things he had not expected. A stack of books on the coffee table about labor history and economic inequality. A framed photograph of Robert Ashford on the mantelpiece. Not the formal portrait from the lobby, but a candid shot of him laughing, his tie loose, his sleeves rolled up. The other guests were already there. George Patterson stood near the fireplace, talking to one of the institutional shareholders. 2 senior staff members Marcus recognized from meetings were in the dining room, examining the table settings. A woman Marcus did not recognize was speaking with an older man who turned out to be the chairman of the fund's advisory committee. Victoria introduced Marcus and Lily to everyone. Lily stayed close to her father, her hand gripping his jacket. The dinner itself was catered but not ostentatious. Roast chicken, vegetables, bread that was still warm. Victoria seated Marcus at one end of the table and herself at the other, with Lily between them. The conversation during the meal was polite, careful. the kind of talk that happens when people are still figuring out the boundaries of what can be said. It was only after dessert, when coffee had been served and Lily had been allowed to sit in the living room with a book, that the conversation shifted. One of the senior staff members, a woman named Patricia, who ran logistics, turned to Marcus. "I have to ask, what made you decide to give away the dividends instead of keeping them?" Marcus set down his coffee cup. "Because I know what it's like to choose between my daughter's medication and rent. And I know there are people in your building making that same choice every month. The money would have made my life easier, but it wouldn't have changed anything for them." The institutional shareholder, a man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses, leaned forward. "That's admirable. But do you think it's sustainable? The fund is designed to help children of operational staff, but what happens when the need outpaces the resources?" Victoria answered before Marcus could. "Then we expand the resources. This isn't charity. It's an investment in the people who make the company work. If we can't afford to take care of them, we can't afford to operate." George Patterson spoke from his end of the table. Robert believed that the purpose of a company isn't just to generate profit. It's to create value for everyone it touches: employees, customers, communities. He spent 40 years building Ashford on that principle. The fund is a return to that vision. The conversation continued for another hour, shifting from the fund to broader questions about corporate responsibility, wage structures, healthcare access. Marcus listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, people listened. At one point, Patricia asked him what he thought would make the biggest difference for operational staff beyond the fund. "Respect," he said, "not performative respect, actual respect. That means listening when people tell you there's a problem. That means not making them feel invisible when they walk through the building. That means understanding that the person cleaning your office has a family and a mortgage and problems that are just as real as yours." The room was quiet for a moment. Then the advisory committee chairman, a man named Richard who had spent 30 years in labor advocacy, nodded slowly. "That's the hardest part. Changing culture. You can write new policies, allocate new budgets, create new programs. But if the people at the top still see the people at the bottom as disposable, none of it matters." Victoria looked at Marcus across the table. "That's why I asked him to take the chief people officer role, because he won't let us forget." The dinner ended around 11. Lily had fallen asleep on the couch in the living room, the book still open in her lap. Marcus picked her up carefully, and Victoria walked them to the door. She handed Marcus a small box wrapped in brown paper. "For Lily. She can open it when she wakes up." Marcus shifted Lily's weight in his arms. "You didn't have to do that. I wanted to." He carried Lily down the steps to the car and drove home through streets that were empty except for the occasional taxi. When they got back to the apartment, he laid Lily on her bed without waking her and covered her with a blanket. Then he opened the box Victoria had given him. Inside was a medical alert bracelet, rose gold with Lily's name engraved on the front and her asthma information on the back. There was also a note, handwritten on Victoria's stationery. "For Lily. So she knows someone is looking out for her. Always." Marcus set the bracelet on Lily's nightstand and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, watching her sleep. The fund's second round of applications opened in June. By then, word had spread beyond Ashford Industries. Parents from other companies in the area began calling, asking if their children were eligible. Marcus had to explain over and over that the fund was restricted to Ashford employees. But he also started keeping a list of the calls, the names and stories, the children who needed help and would not get it because their parents worked for the wrong company. He brought the list to a meeting with Victoria and George in early July. "We're getting 50 calls a week from people who don't qualify. I can't keep telling them no." Victoria studied the list. "What are you proposing?" "I'm proposing we expand. Not just Ashford. A separate fund, administered the same way, open to any working family in the Boston area that meets income requirements." George looked up from his notes. "That's a different scale entirely. You'd need partnerships, corporate sponsors, a full-time staff." "I know. But we've already proven the model works. And if we don't do it, who will?" Victoria set the list down. "I'll talk to the board. But I need you to understand something. If we do this, you're not just running a fund anymore, you're building an organization. That's a full-time job." Marcus met her eyes. "I'm ready." The expanded fund, renamed the Webb Family Foundation, launched in September with backing from 3 other Boston-based companies and a matching grant from a local philanthropic trust. Marcus hired a staff of 4, including a case manager, an accountant, and 2 intake coordinators. The office moved to a larger space in Dorchester, close to Marcus's apartment. He worked 12-hour days, 6 days a week, learning how to manage budgets and donor relations and media inquiries. Lily started 4th grade at a new school closer to the foundation's office. Her asthma had stabilized, the attacks less frequent now that they could afford the preventive medications. She wore the medical alert bracelet Victoria had given her every day. When her teacher asked about it during the first week of school, Lily explained that it was a gift from a friend of her father's. In October, Victoria invited Marcus to dinner again, but this time it was just the 2 of them. They met at a small Italian restaurant in the North End, the kind of place that did not take reservations and served wine in juice glasses. They sat at a table in the back, away from the window, and ordered without looking at the menu because the waiter told them what was good that night. "I wanted to thank you," Victoria said after the food arrived, "for what you've done with the foundation. My father would have been proud." Marcus shook his head. "You're the one who made it possible. You could have fought the will, contested the fund, made this as difficult as you wanted. But you didn't." She looked at him, and there was something softer in her expression than he had seen before. "I didn't do it because I'm a good person. I did it because I didn't want to spend the rest of my life wondering what he saw in you that I couldn't. And now I see it." They ate in comfortable silence for a while. Then Victoria set down her fork and leaned back in her chair. "Can I ask you something personal?" Marcus nodded. "Do you ever think about dating again? It's been 3 years since Sarah died." Marcus considered the question. "I think about it sometimes. But it's hard to imagine someone understanding what my life looks like. The foundation, Lily, the fact that I still spend 2 days a week cleaning floors because I don't want to forget where I came from." Victoria smiled. "You'd be surprised what people can understand if you give them the chance." There was something in the way she said it that made Marcus look at her more carefully. She did not look away. The moment stretched, fragile and uncertain, until the waiter appeared with the check and the spell broke. Marcus paid, ignoring Victoria's protest, and they walked out into the cool October night. The streets were crowded with people leaving restaurants and bars, the noise of the city filling the spaces between them. They stood on the sidewalk, neither quite ready to leave. "I should get home. Lily's with Margaret tonight, but I don't like being out too late." Victoria nodded. "I understand." She reached out and touched his arm lightly, briefly, then stepped back. "Thank you for dinner, and for everything else." Marcus watched her walk to her car, then turned and headed toward his own. He drove home slowly, taking the long route, thinking about the way her hand had felt on his arm and the way she had smiled when she said people could understand if you gave them the chance. When he got back to the apartment, he called Margaret and asked how Lily was doing. She was asleep, Margaret said. No problems. Marcus thanked her and hung up. Then he sat on the couch and stared at the ceiling, replaying the dinner in his mind, wondering if he had imagined the shift in the air between them. 3 months later, on a cold January afternoon, Marcus was at the Foundation's office when his phone rang. It was Lily's school. There had been an incident. Lily had collapsed during recess, a severe asthma attack, and the paramedics had taken her to Massachusetts General. Marcus was in his car before the call ended, driving too fast through traffic that refused to move, his hands tight on the wheel. He arrived at the hospital and found Lily in the emergency room, an oxygen mask over her face, her eyes wide and scared. A nurse was adjusting an IV while a doctor made notes on a clipboard. Marcus pushed through the door and went straight to her bedside. "Hey, Lil, I'm here." Lily reached for his hand. Her grip was weak but insistent. The doctor looked up. "Mr. Webb, Your daughter had a significant bronchospasm. We've administered albuterol and started her on corticosteroids. She's stable now, but we'd like to keep her overnight for observation." Marcus nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The doctor left. Marcus pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down, still holding Lily's hand. "You're okay. You're going to be okay." Lily's voice was muffled by the mask. "I was scared. I know. But you're safe now." He stayed with her through the afternoon and into the evening, refusing to leave even when the nurses suggested he get coffee or take a break. Margaret arrived around 6 with a change of clothes and Lily's stuffed rabbit. She sat with them for an hour, then left to give them space. At 8:30, Victoria appeared in the doorway. Marcus looked up, surprised. "Margaret called me. I hope that's all right." Marcus nodded. Victoria came in and stood at the foot of the bed, looking at Lily. "How is she?" "Stable. They're keeping her overnight." Victoria pulled up a second chair and sat down. She did not ask if Marcus wanted company. She simply stayed. They sat in silence for a long time, the only sounds the beeping of the monitor and the hiss of oxygen through Lily's mask. Around midnight, a nurse came in to check Lily's vitals. She was asleep by then, her breathing steady. The nurse adjusted the flow on the oxygen and left. Marcus leaned back in his chair, exhausted. Victoria reached over and placed her hand on his. "You should go home, get some rest. I'll stay with her." Marcus looked at her. "You don't have to do that." "I know, but I want to." He studied her face, saw the sincerity there, and felt something shift inside him. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The understanding that this woman who 6 months ago had fired him without a second thought was now sitting in a hospital room at midnight offering to watch over his daughter. "Okay, but call me if anything changes." Victoria squeezed his hand. "I will." Marcus stood, leaned over to kiss Lily's forehead, and left. He drove home in a daze, too tired to think clearly, and fell asleep on the couch, still wearing his shoes. When he woke at 6 the next morning, there was a text from Victoria. "Lily had a good night. No episodes. Doctor will evaluate at 8. Marcus showered, changed, and drove back to the hospital. Lily was awake, sitting up in bed, eating Jell-O from a plastic cup. Victoria was still there, sitting in the same chair, her jacket draped over the back. She looked exhausted, but alert. "Morning." Marcus sat down beside her. "You stayed all night." She nodded. "I told you I would." Lily looked up from her Jell-O. "Miss Victoria read me 3 chapters of my book, the one about the girl who talks to animals." Marcus looked at Victoria, who shrugged. She couldn't sleep. "I figured it would help." The doctor came in at 8:15 and cleared Lily for discharge. Marcus signed the paperwork and they left the hospital together, Victoria walking beside them to the parking garage. When they reached Marcus's car, Lily climbed into the back seat and buckled herself in. Marcus turned to Victoria. "Thank you, for staying, for everything." Victoria looked at him, and there was something unguarded in her expression. "I meant what I said at dinner, about people understanding if you give them a chance. I'd like you to give me that chance." Marcus did not answer immediately. He thought about Sarah, about the promise he had made to teach Lily that dignity was not about what you owned, but about how you treated people. He thought about Victoria, who had spent the last 6 months learning that lesson in ways that cost her pride and certainty and control. "I'd like that too." She smiled, and it was the kind of smile that reached her eyes. "Good. Then let's start slow. Coffee next week?" "Coffee sounds good." Marcus drove Lily home, got her settled on the couch with her book and her inhaler, and sat down beside her. She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders. "Dad, do you like Miss Victoria?" Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, Lil, I think I do. She's nice. I like her too." They sat together in the quiet apartment, the winter sunlight streaming through the window, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus allowed himself to imagine a future that was not just about survival. The coffee date turned into dinner. Dinner turned into a walk along the Charles River on a Sunday afternoon. By spring, Victoria was a regular presence in Marcus and Lily's life, joining them for pizza on Friday nights, attending Lily's school play, helping Marcus review grant applications at the foundation. In May, on the second anniversary of Robert Ashford's death, Ashford Industries held a memorial service in the same lobby where Marcus had been fired 2 years earlier. The event was different this time. Operational staff were invited not as invisible support, but as honored guests. Margaret sat in the front row beside Victoria. Tom Garrison, the security guard who had witnessed Derek kick the warning sign, gave a speech about the changes he had seen in the company culture. Marcus stood at the podium and spoke about Robert, about the letter he had left, about the lesson it had taught them all. When the service ended, Victoria walked down the grand staircase, the same staircase where she had stumbled and fired Marcus. But this time, Lily was waiting at the bottom, holding a bouquet of white lilies. Victoria knelt down to accept them, and photographers captured the moment. The image would later appear in the Boston Globe under the headline, "Ashford Industries Honors Legacy of Compassion." That evening, Marcus and Victoria stood on the rooftop garden of the Ashford building, looking out at the city as the sun set. Lily was with Margaret, giving them a rare evening alone. "Do you ever think about what your father would say if he could see us now?" Victoria leaned against the railing. "I think he'd say he knew exactly what he was doing." Marcus smiled. "He was a smart man." Victoria turned to face him. "He saw something in you that I couldn't, and he saw something in me that I didn't want to admit. He knew we'd both have to change to meet each other halfway. And have we?" She reached for his hand. "I think we're getting there." Marcus pulled her close, and they stood together in the fading light. The city stretched out below them, the future uncertain but no longer frightening. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang. Marcus thought about Sarah, about the promise he had made, about the life he had built from the wreckage of loss. He thought about Lily, growing stronger every day, her laughter filling the apartment with something that felt like hope. And he thought about Victoria, who had learned to see what her father had seen, who had chosen to change when she could have chosen to stay the same. "That's all any of us can do," he said quietly. "Keep getting there."